Welcome back to Unfiltered Feels. Today, we're talking about something that's wrapped in secrecy, shame, and a whole lot of misunderstanding. The guilt tied with substance use. Whether it's alcohol, prescription meds, or harder drugs, this conversation isn't about judgment. It's about truth. Because behind every substance use story is a person, a reason, a history, and often a deep lingering guilt. If you've ever thought, why did I do that? What damage did I cause? Will they ever trust me again? Or even, can I ever forgive myself? Then this episode is for you. I've had people close to me wrestle with this. I've seen the guilt eat away at their confidence, even in recovery. They'd say things like, I'm sober now, but I still hate the person I was. I miss all those birthdays. I missed life. I hurt people I love and I can't fix that. And what I've learned is, healing is never just physical. You can stop using, but the emotional fallout, that's the long game. That's where guilt hides. In the quiet spaces, the what ifs, and the relationships we wish we could rewind. Up next, you're going to hear a story from a mom who hit rock bottom and came back stronger than ever before. She is an inspiration, and she shows that there is hope for everyone. So please, if you're struggling, if you're in your recovery, if you want to start, please listen, because I think she'll be able to give you a little bit of hope. So without further ado, here we go. Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Not too bad. I'm Allie, and if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Taylor Shanahan. A small introduction of myself would be I'm a 29-year-old mother. I have 3 beautiful babies. They have been my life source for, I owe them a lot, to be honest. So a lot of this podcast, I feel, I carry a lot of this same things we talked about previous to recording in the introduction, but I'm a recovering drug addict. I have 8 almost years. It'll be 8 full years this upcoming February. Recovery looks different for a lot of people. And I guess the subject of the matter is guilt today. And throughout my addiction, I felt lots of guilt.
Okay, so this first question is kind of a two-parter. In the past, can you describe what your relationship with substances were? And then once you do that, we'll do what it is like now.
How can one describe a relationship that ultimately destroyed my life but saved it? In my past, it took over my life. A lot of people, me, for example, it wasn't until I got into my recovery journey did I really understand that addiction isn't just a choice, it's a disease. Like it runs in my family. I had a family branch in my family's tree before I was even a twinkle in my mom's eye. My grandfather took his own life from an overdose, and then 40 years later, my dad died the same tragic death. My mom, a few months ago, tried to take her own life by, again, overdose. It was familiar to me. One might feel the sense of guilt, but others might feel a sense of normality. For example, I didn't get diagnosed with ADHD until I was 27 years old. So I went 27 years being misdiagnosed, and I didn't know, I was chasing a chemical that I was lacking in my brain. And, and the more I got into my recovery journey and the more I got educated, and I didn't know what I didn't know. And I guess now, sorry, bring me back.
You're okay. What is substance like now? Or your relationship, I guess?
I don't really have a relationship with it anymore. I've had 8 full years of recovery, but again, everyone looks at recovery differently. There's so many different paths to recovery. For example, You have AA, you have NA, you have all these different kinds of groups, these different kinds of things that you can deal with. There's MAP programs that help people who, need substances or, need ADHD medication or, X, Y, and Z. I guess it looks different for everyone else. But yeah, it's different now. I'm more educated. I'm alive, to say the least. And I'm grateful for it.
Again, congratulations on being sober for that long. That's a long time. And honestly, that's a big deal, especially with children, because it's hard enough as it is. So good job. Since today we're talking about guilt, was there ever a moment that you can remember where guilt really hit you?
The moment I seen my reflection in the back of a cop car. It was a reflection I didn't see. I've never, you're looking at yourself and you're like, who is this person? I don't recognize this person. How did it get this bad? And you're looking back at your choices and, I was a domestic violence survivor for almost 5 years with my baby daddy. And, when I was using, it wasn't using to just get high and just be a menace. I was using to escape, to numb, to deal with the situation I had to deal with. I tried to leave. I tried to change. I tried to get clean 1,010,000 times. And ultimately it came to the point where I'm in handcuffs and you have no other choice but to see what your addiction has done. But in that time capsule too, you can potentially see what could be, not just what has been, but how can I continue to live, or what can I do to fix this, or, what's the next step from here? Yes, staying clean is one step, but there's so many more that goes with it. A lot of people that are addicts are running from multitudes of problems. If it's not childhood trauma, if it's not circumstantial, if it's not, the first time I ever tried a substance was when I was in the 3rd grade, the day before 3rd grade. I was getting my tonsils removed and I got prescribed liquid Loratab, or most injuries in high school, what's the first thing they prescribe them? A painkiller, and that's where most addictions start, or it comes through the family. But yeah.
So I think this episode is going to bring people who have used, who have recovered, maybe who are still using, and then others who have never went through this. Could you describe to somebody who's never went through this, who's never felt this way, what it feels like to want to stop so badly, but ultimately not being able to at that moment?
It's hard. It's hard to, you can tell yourself one day, I'm going to quit cold turkey. I'm done. I'm just sick of this lifestyle. I'm done. And then the next moment you have your baby daddy or whatever the circumstances. And that one inspiration of hope you once had, just that moment shattered, and most people get so scared of recovery because of the statistics. Can you imagine if someone's trying to get clean and you have people preaching to you all the time, only 2% of people recover. Oh, you'll never do it. If I listened to half the things that people have told me, I wouldn't be where I am today. But ultimately, it's the stigma against it too. Like, I've never seen something, an intangible word be so tangible. How it can just ruin so many things, but create so many beautiful things. There was a phrase that I had heard the other day that went into reference of these two brothers. And if you ask these two brothers why they ended up the way they did, one of them was a successful man and the other one was a drunk. And if you ask them both, they'll tell you, because of my father. They had the choice. You know what I'm saying? Like, we can be like that or we can be different. We have the choice to be in the environment and continue to live in that environment. But when you know better, you have the choice to do better. And a lot of the times people don't know how to do better until they get locked up, until they're taken out of the situation and made to sober up, or you're taken out of that toxic living environment, or, let's talk about the homeless population, because that goes right in there. When you're at rock bottom, you're at rock bottom. What more can be taken from you? And quite frankly, a lot of people think that, aren't you scared of death? Because, you know what you're doing, at the same time, after so many years, but at that point, you welcome it, and you just don't know how to get out of it. It wasn't until I started getting into my recovery journey that there was more resources popping up. There was more avenues to it wasn't just one way, or, you just had to do it this way, or there were so many different levels to it. There's different healing techniques. There's, what I'm saying? For example, people can go down the AA path, or what if someone doesn't really have a spiritual higher power? Where do they follow? Because one of the very first basic rules is have a higher power. But what if you've never been taught to know what a higher power is? So what are you basing it on? And when I sat time in prison, I was a culture shock. I'm a woman living in Escanaba. I have my whole entire life. There's not a lot of, it's shell shocked, you could say the least, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into? I'm far away from home, Toto. It was bad. And I guess it was that moment too, that you're willing to do anything to make sure that you get that high, whether it be selling this, selling that, or being the middleman for that, or, sometimes people don't understand either. You do it in order to survive. If you've never been taught coping mechanisms, if you've never, if you come from a family that shoves everything underneath the rug, and God forbid you were to talk about the big pink elephant in the room for the day, you know what I'm saying? You're shamed for it. You're the black sheep. You're the problem. Why are we talking about this? And it's what do you mean? Why aren't we talking about this? This is generational stuff. This is, things that we should talk about. And it's when nobody wants to talk about it that you're forced to sit and think about, all right, what do I have to do now? And a lot of people get stuck in old perceptions of what people used to be, and it's still a problem for me now, and I understand it. I understand both sides of the coin. I understand. At one point, I did terrible things. I was an addict. I was at the lowest point in my life, and I was a terrible friend. I was a terrible mom. I was, and I can admit all of that stuff. But on the other side of the coin, I've changed my life, and I've proven my actions time and time again. And it's something that still holds me back, 8 years, and I've proven myself over that time. And I still have to fight for equality for my children and I. That stigma against recovery and drug addicts and everything, and just addiction in itself, it's real. I've never seen it so tangible until it came down to people judging me and my children, or looking at me differently and looking at my kids differently, or treating them differently. Because, for example, I didn't get my diagnosis of ADHD until I was 27. My son just got diagnosed. I'm a recovering drug addict. His dad's a drug addict. I don't feel comfortable putting my child on a narcotic to make your life easier. I'm sorry, I don't. Can we learn a different way where we can teach at his level? Can we look at IEPs? Can we look at something different? Because you're not looking at him as the whole person he is. You're looking at him like he's a problem, but you're not looking at the fact that the 7-year-old boy has lived more than you have your whole entire existence and is still here. And it's a scope that I have to, I paid my price, I paid my dues, I've changed my life, but it's hard to break that stigma for my children, because, oh, your mom was a convict, she was a junkie, she was, she went to prison, she did this, and I've seen how it detoured certain people, allowing their kids to come hang out, and I get it, on a total, standpoint, I understand in a mother's, and then the other side of it, I feel bad. I didn't know that my addictions back then were still going to come back 8 years and then some to come show me that the past is still real, but what do? And it's hard to really talk about, like, there's so many faces that guilt plays, I suppose. There's the good guilt, the bad guilt, you know, um, ultimately it's like what we do with that. Are we going to stay stuck in it? Are we going to learn something from it? Are we going to keep living in it every day? If I would have stayed stuck, I wouldn't be here.
So, for people who are maybe just starting their recovery journey or maybe are well into it and are maybe struggling right now, do you have any words for them or any advice that you would like to give, or anything that helped you got through when maybe you felt like, can I actually do this? Can I move on? Can I continue to be the person I've grown into?
It's possible. If you would have asked me 10 years, like 8 years ago, if it would have been possible, the first thing I would have said is no. But if there's anyone that can show you or testify to you today that it is possible, I am your living proof. Some say that, addicts will never get their kids back. Addicts can never do this, they'll never do that. Well, my addictions landed me in prison, and my felonies never disqualified me from working for the state of Michigan with the maternal infant health program, working with pregnant women for women who had opioid use disorders. That didn't stop me from being vice president to a nonprofit organization under the district court judge. It didn't stop me. It didn't stop me from just wanting better for not only myself but my children. But I did damage in my community too. Let's be honest. I went to prison for selling drugs. Yeah, you're right. I did deserve that, and my community deserves better. So I put out better. And it's possible. All it takes is just this little ounce of faith. That's it. And good things can happen. Your life is worth living. It's never worth giving in to or succumbing to a version of yourself you could never imagine.
If you could pick one thing in your recovery that you are most proud of, that you accomplished or that you did, what would that be?
There's multitudes of things, genuinely, but it's how I never gave up on myself. I have full custody of my children, so full legal custody, and it's pretty unheard of for someone who's been to prison, who was an addict, X, Y, and Z. I had to fight tooth and nail against the state of Michigan, and let me tell you what, it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. I had to do it twice, and it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but ultimately, it's hard to do, but it was the most beautiful thing, because it not only taught me my resilience, but it showed my children that your mom's never going to give up on having you in her life, or where you stand in my life. I owe my children everything. They are the reason I am here today. They are the reason I got decided to get into recovery. They are my saving graces, and I owe them everything. And I tear up when I say that, because they're young yet, and they don't comprehend yet just how divine truly they are, and just how much they've impacted my life, but so many others too. Not only that, but 3 years ago, my father died of an overdose, and as a recovering addict, it's a life-altering statement. It's a shattering life experience that I wouldn't wish upon my worst nightmare. Me and my dad used to use together. We had that, and that was the only kind of relationship we ever had. And I guess how I went about that was to not let his death go in vain. I can sit here and cry and say how unjust it is, and who F fentanyl dealers and everything else, and I can do all that, and it's righteous, yes, but what can I do so nobody else has to feel this same pain, that no other family has to receive that same call or feel that just gut wrenching, like what just happened feeling. Like, this could have been prevented, and it could have been prevented had there had been Narcan, and instead I used, when I was working for the state and for Families Against Narcotics, I was able to donate over 3,000 boxes of Narcan just to prevent someone else from reliving that same tragic moment.
Wow. And I think that's a powerful, everything you just shared is very powerful testament to you, because you're right. People do have that stigma. You were who you were, but now you are who you are. And, I know your children are young, but you said it yourself, they see you now and they see how hard you're working, and that's going to stick with them. And I think that that's, a great testament to you, and that will also make your children stronger and resilient, even more than they already are, I'm sure.
Very much so. Another thing too is, being a recovering, drug addict, but also because of my addiction, I became a 2-time, drug felon, which also came with its own consequences. Like that's something that carries around with me for, until I can get it expunged or X, Y, and Z. But like, that's a ball and chain I have to carry around, not only for myself, but for my kids. For example, I was working as a coach at AAA Gymnastics, and unfortunately, there came a conflict where I couldn't be at the gym during the time where the high school team was because I was a felon, even though it was my job and I'm getting paid to be there. And you know what I'm saying? Because I'm a felon from 8 years ago, even though I've done all of this amazing things, you guys are giving me problems because I'm here on a totally different thing. But what are you saying, that because I'm a felon, I can't volunteer my time or be around students, because my children are students of the same school district, and I don't know who you're telling that I can't go and volunteer. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not going to work for me, and I'm going to tell you why. Because, statistically speaking, after everything my children have been through, I can't imagine, like my ACE score, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience Test, and that has a lot to do with like statistics wise and like how that affects children and like their learning developments, learning disabilities, everything else into those kind of categories. But ADHD, I forgot where I was at. I'll reel it back a little. Ultimately, I had to fight tooth and nail. I had to go have a meeting with the superintendent. I had to share my story, my testimony, and I had to fight again tooth and nail with this man to explain to him that, we can't look at every case the same. Like I can understand why most people do. And, we get this reputation of X, Y, and Z, but I'm telling you, I have, this documentation that like I'm a certified peer recovery coach. Like, why is it that I can work for the state, but I can't volunteer my time for, for my kid's school event? And finally I got to share my story in front of the school board and was voted in as the first felon parent as a district volunteer at, in Delta County. And I was like, that's kind of cool. Like that's unheard of.
That is very cool.
But it opens windows, for other parents that, hey, yeah, you made a mistake. Your addiction landed you in some places you didn't want to be in, but that doesn't mean that later on you can't be in your kids' lives. You know what I'm saying? There's possibilities. You just have to be open to like receiving the possibilities. Like, okay, this is what happens when I get high. Well, what can happen when I get sober? Like, what happens when I choose recovery? What happens when I choose to heal? What happens when I choose to take accountability? Like what only good things can happen from that. And I think a lot of the times that people struggle with is, they don't want to look at themselves and admit the damage they've done. I've shared my testimony in front of thousands of people. I'll be the first person to tell somebody, my mishaps, and a lot of people aren't like that. And I guess it's the transparency of it, You just don't know what can help somebody. You don't know what someone might need, or like, that little bit of advice. I mean, to this day, I ran into my 5th grade teacher when I was working at Five Corners, and there's a little piece of advice she gave me as a 5th grader. She's like, don't you ever get a credit card, terrible, like all this. I've never gotten a credit card. And thank God my credit score is great. Even through my addiction, I didn't get a credit card. Thank you, Miss Schmidt. Like, you're great. But like, it's things like that where like those little bits of pieces of information might come in use one day, that little piece of hope, or like that little story, or, oh, I seen this girl do it, or I heard she could do it, or he, whatever it may be.
Right. And that's really, part of the reason why I wanted these stories, because I feel like even though maybe, we have different lives, we've been through different things. However, I think that substance use affects everybody in different ways. And on the flip side of that, I was not a user, but I was around people. And my thought was, I'm not important enough. What can I do to be more important? You have that other side of it. And I think sometimes instead of us just speaking to each other and trying to understand each other, we just kind of push ourselves farther and farther and farther apart. And, like you just said, it could have just been a simple conversation that maybe there could have been just a little bit in there that might have just opened somebody's eyes. And who knows what could have happened, right? Obviously, that's not going to happen with every case, but you just never know.
I feel for you, truly. I remember being that little girl, not understanding, why is that bottle more important than me? Where's my dad? Why is he calling me from jail? Why isn't he here? But not only that, like, it's, you don't understand what you don't understand. And I guess in a sense, like, I didn't know that his father had died tragically of an overdose. He was a Vietnam vet. He had 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He saved soldiers' lives for, the list goes on. But like, addiction comes in and it has no preference. It has, it's either it's coming to collect its prey, dead or alive. And if you're in the target space, like, it's there, in some cases, like, it comes down through generations and generations, and, it becomes a normality. It's something that you're so used to seeing, and you don't understand it. It's like, and I see it from a daughter's perspective now too, like, and like, as a mom and like a recovering addict and things, and I can't imagine, what my kids have felt, because there was a time where like, I have gotten to my knees and I've cried to them, and I had told them it was never their fault. It was never their fault. It was something so far out of their control. And it wasn't that I didn't love them. It's that I didn't love myself. I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to cope with childhood trauma. For example, I was 6 years old when I found my first dead body. I was living on and off with my grandparents, and my grandfather died from cancer. And I was 6 when I woke up and I had found his dead body. My mom was 18 when she had me. My parents were unmarried. It was like a Romeo Juliet type stuff, but like one came from a wealthy family and not the other. And I loved staying with my grandparents, and because of that, I had to see a lot of hardships at a very, very young age. And, for me to see it now, I can see now that maybe I had going through that and living through what I did might save them from reliving that experience. Maybe I had to go through what I had to go through to break those chains off for them. Maybe I had to feel that to make sure that they never had to feel that. And maybe they'll never understand why, or like what causes it. Because like, a lot of people don't understand either, is like, it's a genetic brain disease. But not only that, like the ADA classifies opioid addiction and addiction as a disability. This is a chronic life, condition that everyone, like an addict, fights their whole entire life for. Can you imagine, like, having an opioid problem in high school because you broke a leg, and you're now 26 and you're still depending on a medication that you took 10 years ago because the pain hasn't went away, or you don't know how to deal with the pain that Band-Aid held on for so long. Like, you don't know how to deal with any of that. You're so used to functioning like this, so you can function at a normality. What are you trying to do? You're trying to heal your body, trying to feel better so you can get back to working, going to school, playing sports, whatever it may be. And it became so bad where half the time you didn't even know it, like it became that bad. You see it, but you don't see it sometimes. You're oblivious. It's when you want to pull off the rose-colored glasses. But yeah, I do remember feeling that kind of stuff, and I feel for you. And there's nothing you could have done. There's nothing you could have said. There was nothing nobody could have told me then. The little bits of hopes, and I remember, like, pieces of conversations, but there was nothing nobody could have done. I had to go down what I had to do, and I had to go down that path to face whatever I had to face. And most people don't come out alive.
Right. So do you feel like now you've done all this? You mentioned briefly a little bit ago you didn't love yourself. How do you feel about yourself now?
I genuinely enjoy my company. When I was in prison, I had nothing but time to sit there and spend by myself. I had just went there right before COVID. So when COVID hit, you went from like having full population to 23-hour lockdowns. You better get used to it. You had no other choice. Unfortunately, I had restitution and fines, and I could only get $50 a month in there. So survival in there is, if you can imagine the prices out here, well, try 10 times more for littler quantities in prison, and you make do with what you have. But I had to I had to spend that time alone. I had to take off the masks that people, the perceptions of what others wanted me to be, or what they wanted me to do with my life, or like what others thought of what I should have been. Like I ask people this question all the time, like, who are you? Do you know who you are? You can tell me your government name. You can tell me, you know what I'm saying? But like, genuinely, do you know your energy presence? Do you know your aura? Do you know, like, that kind of stuff? Like, when you heal the most, the wounds that brought us to the brinks of our knees, it's an intangible beauty. It's like finding the broken pieces of your own mosaic, and you're the golden lining. Like, yes, I'm broken, but I'm the most broken, beautiful, wreck there is. And it's a different journey. It's a different story for everybody. And it took me a long, long time to learn how to love myself, how to just enjoy what it is that Taylor wants, or who Taylor is, or what she aspires to be. I didn't want to live in the image of, what my mother wanted, or, I didn't want to live in the shadow of my dad, and that was the thing. I was always letting, other people's like decisions or choices or perceptions of me affect how I felt about myself. Example, I had daddy wounds, growing up. Not only that, I watched death happen at a very young age. So I knew there was a beginning and ending to life before, like, I was like kindergarten, first grade, and these people are talking about like little ponies, and I'm attending like funerals. Like, ooh, it's not even there. I was living with my grandparents, and here, I was going to Holy Name School. It's a Catholic school. It's an expensive school on top of it. Like, so, my grandparents were paying for that, but like, the people I'm going to school with, their families they're married. They come from successful homes, like, multitudes of businesses, and just good people. And here I come, and like, hi, hello. I pretty much live with my grandparents, and X, Y, and Z, and I just felt so different right away. I just felt like Nobody knew what I was going through, or like the comprehension. Like, how do you tell another 6-year-old, like, yeah, this is what I just walked in on? Or like, how do you even explain those feelings to any adults or anybody else? You're just kind of sat there and forced to be like, this is what life is. Just like moments ago, healthy and thriving, and then just, hours later, dust. And I guess that's the revolution of time. And I guess, I was looking back at the questions, and I was getting so just amped up, like, oh, I don't know how to answer this and everything else. I'm kind of glad we talked all these things out, because it's like these conversations can go so many different ways, or like so educate, like there's just so many different aspects to it, and I didn't know any of the aspects until, I put myself through school and, got my certified peer recovery coach, and then I got my community health worker certificate. Now I'm going to Bay College for the law program. It's, you can't fix a broken system. However, you can add structure to a collapsing system. I've lived inside and outside of the system, as have my kids, and not only can their story, like, help other people, but it's the journey of resilience with like a mother and her baby cubs, like, like what else can be thrown at us, and it's, it's had its bad effects, it's had its good effects, but honestly, in a way too, I'm my kids are brilliant. You know what I'm saying? Like their problem solving skills, like not only that, they're street smart. They're not dumb in any kind of sense. Like they have common sense, but like it baffles me just how good hearted and natured they are after like the shitty circumstances that have been given to them. And like,
Right.
again, why can't we all look at it like that in a choice? Like we have the choice to, like, when I was coaching for gymnastics, there was this little girl like who would come up to me, and there you can let your inner child out, you could play, you're interacting with kids, you're supposed to make it fun, and like that's a time where you can like let that inner child be out. And there was this little girl who came up to me and she's like, Miss Taylor, are you gonna let your child out today? I'm like, are you talking about my inner child? If you guys like listen today, yes, she can come out play. And it's when I was able to let her come out and play, and heal those inner child wounds, did the beautiful work ever begin. And now I'm coaching for my son's soccer league, and let me tell you what, this kid has never been on the soccer field, has never had a day of practice in his life, and I was a little intimidated how he moved on the field, and I'm playing soccer and I'm sitting here like, where'd you learn these moves? And it just goes to show, because it's like I had such a hard time with his teacher, trying to get him an IEP and like trying to go different routes for his ADHD, and like I'm not trying to make excuses for my kid either, but like, he doesn't have a dad in his life. I just got engaged, so I'm really thankful my fiance has stepped up and filled in that role, because little does he know just how much he's helped them heal as well. It was, as a single mom, and especially having, full custody of my kids after coming home from prison, and like I didn't have time to like really, it was again culture shock after coming home from prison and then right back into society. Like I didn't know how to deal with people. I had like, I went 3 years without seeing anybody. I didn't have a single visit. I didn't, you know what I'm saying? It was a phone conversation every day I had with my kids, and it was shell shocking coming home. Everything's changed, and you're like, what's really going on here? I don't know anything anymore. What's going on? And yeah, it was I didn't really get the time to really sit and adjust to like my environment. I had no other choice. My choices were get an apartment. You better hurry up and get that. You better get, stable transportation. You got to get a job. You got to get this. And if you get all that, you can get your children back. The hoops I had to jump through to even make that possible was like slim to none. It's almost as equivalent to being struck by lightning 5 times in a row than for me to be standing in my shoes today, like sharing my testimony. And it's crazy. Because I look at my dad and I look at like my stories, and But it's crazy because it's like you just don't think it's ever going to happen to you. You don't think it's ever going to happen to this person. You don't. And I'm telling you, my dad was a veteran drug addict, like, and it was shocking to me, because like he wasn't dumb, and it just happened like that. But like ultimately too, like that stigma still lives for like those dead people. And if I could tell you like the amount of injustice they did to him, even being dead as an addict, like it's inhumane, and it's like, I understand like you can have a stigma over a description, a narrative, or a noun to a human, but we're still talking about a living, existing person, or like, someone that had a family, a daughter, a son, you know what I'm saying? And here we are just not caring about any of it. We're going to just, do what we do and not bring anything of any kind of closure. He was working on the road. He was working for the carnival, and, that was kind of his lifestyle. I had to cut him off when I came home from prison. And, one of the questions you had asked, like, was there ever a moment that you felt guilt? And I think it was the moment that I had received the call that he had died. And I had just started out on my recovery journey. I was sharing my story. I was, doing good, but ultimately I knew I had to cut him off. I couldn't save him. There was nothing I could have done. He was one of the first people to, hey, you want some of this? As soon as I got home from prison, I'm like, are you nuts? Have you ever sat in prison? I don't want to go back there. Like, I'm good. The boot stocks, like, I'm straight. Like, I'm good. You can keep that. But, like, that's when I knew. Some people don't know how to change. They're scared of change. And that's why they never will, and like, it's not until people step out of their comfort zone where do they see like this whole time we've been drowning in a puddle when all we had to do was stand up. All we had to do was brush it off, deal with a few, things. And it's just, I'm grateful for my experience overall, but, it was hard when I found out my dad died. And, I was a certified peer recovery coach. I was working for FAN. I had all the resources. I had the Narcan. I had, everything I could have gave him. And the thing is if I didn't cut him off, I knew where I was going to go. I knew what was going to happen. I've read the same chapter over and over again. And I finally made the choice to put my foot down and say, I'm done. I love you, but I love me more.
Right.
I felt guilt when I deleted and blocked him off Facebook, and I can't even add him as a friend anymore. I can't even see what's on his profile. And, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, like, was it really worth it? Was it really worth it? You could have, and there was so many things I could have said, but ultimately, I think he knew too, like that was the only bond we ever had, and that bond had to end.
Right. And, obviously he's your parent, you love him, but like you said, you know what's going to happen. You know how that story ends, and you've come this far. You've got your children, you're doing the thing, and you're right. I'm sure the guilt, I'm sure all of the emotions that you felt, but ultimately, like you said, you made the right call, and you're doing wonderful now, and the kids are doing great.
Yeah, they're awesome. Sassy, but let me tell you what, they keep me on my toes, and they remind me. I literally had my first gray hair the other day, and I about cried. I pulled it out, and I was like, do you guys see this? Do you see what you do to me? Do you see? And, it's funny because, I would take real life struggles over dope struggles any day. And it's funny to me. Just, I see people now, and like, I feel for them. At the same time, I chuckle to myself, like, did I really look like that? Like, I look at my mugshot. Like, people look at my mugshot, and they always ask me, well, like, who do addicts look like? Or, like, how? You don't look like an addict. I'm like, really? You want to see my mugshot? And I was like,
I'm different now. That's the whole point.
Or, like, some people, too, have, like, the description, like, people who do, like, or any kind of that stuff, they don't have teeth. And, like... They're like, how? You have your teeth. And I'm like, well, I take care of my teeth. Just because you were an addict doesn't mean you didn't, like, then there's some forms of that too, where like people do start doing that. And like, it comes to that. And, but it's funny to me because it's like, well, what does addiction look like to you? What face does that? Or like, when I tell them I'm a felon, they're like, well, you don't look like a felon. I'm like, well, am I supposed to have a tattoo on my face that says I'm a felon? Or, do you want my MDOC number? And it's not for anything of like, and like, a lot of people are like, well, why do you keep talking about your past and everything else? And it's not like I want to keep living in my past. It's how it can pollute change in these upcoming generations. Because let's be honest, like the stigma against addiction and like recovery and like Narcan and, things of that nature, like Narcan, for example, I always get the controversial, well, it's enabling, it's this, it's that. All Narcan does is enable breathing. For example, did you know that the first person who was administered Narcan in the United States was a 4-year-old boy who got into his parents' drugs? So are you telling me he didn't deserve the chance to breathe? And like that's the concept of things. Or like, I worked for the health department for the maternal infant health program, and there, they did needle exchange programs and X, Y, and Z and things of that. And people are like, oh, well, that's enabling. Yes. In one sense, yes. In the other sense, you're preventing a community from catching HIV, hepatitis C, all these other icky ass diseases that, like, now let's talk about if addict, you're a woman and you're an addict and, you're fertile. Well, what are you going to do then? You don't have very many options. And once you find out you're pregnant, well, you can't hide it for long and you have to go in and, you're terrified to go in because you're an addict and you already know what the story is going to be, and what really gets me too is I feel for those women because I was one of those women. I was an addict. I got pregnant and I'm terrified. These doctors are telling me that like my child can die if I don't get on this medication, like, X, Y, and Z, like they're amping you to get up on this medication. But what they're not telling you is the effects of that medication that are going to have on your life, your child's life, and, just all the bullshit that they had behind the scenes. They didn't tell you that because you're on a medication that your doctor prescribes to you, that CPS is going to come in right after you have a baby, come in and knocking and telling you they're going to come take your kid for taking a medication that was prescribed by a doctor that's federally regulated by the ADA. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is a real life issue. And, now you have these women on these medications, and I was one of them, and I didn't know what I didn't know until later on. I was red flagged at every pharmacy, and I was like, well, I don't get it. I came here to get help. I have this medication. You told me I had to, here's where my odds are, the statistics, you know what I'm saying? Well, likely chance that if I don't get on this medication, my baby's going to die. So, what am I supposed to do here? I'm going to take the medication. I want to be a mom. I want my baby. I don't want to live with that. You know what I'm saying? Like, and they put you on this medication, but like, they don't tell you that the effects of this medication afterwards. They don't tell you the % chance of your child withdrawing off this medication. No, they tell you that it's very rare. No, it happens every single time, and your child's in a NICU for a month and a half. And you have no idea what's going on, and you're still on this medication, but your baby's coming off this medication, and it's a terrible feeling because like, you're trying to do better, but like at the same time, you're trying to get help for your addiction, but like you're trying not to kill your baby, and you're not trying to, go and piss anyone off. But at the same time, like, you're scared, you're terrified because now you have CPS at your door, and you're like, I don't get it. And it doesn't matter. A lot of people are like, oh, for these women to be on these medications, they have to be junkies, X, Y, and Z. No, women who become pregnant on opioids, are offered these kinds of medications so their babies don't be affected or like, miscarriage early or X, Y, and Z. This can happen to anybody that, anybody. And it's scary. They don't tell you these things. And these, a lot of people don't understand too, is like, it's not just in the streets. Do you see addiction? Like, it's doctors too. You go there every month to go get your round of pills because you're so dependent on them. Now you're taking more than what you need to because X, Y, and Z. It could be a million excuses why. Now you're subjecting yourself to a change in environment, change of behavior. You're modifying like how many different kind of chemicals in your own natural brain. Now you're adding so many different things, but it's just crazy. Have you seen like how they're doing, DNA tests for like antidepressants now? Like just how far we've come, and it's crazy. But at the same time, where it's a Band-Aid too, so it aids and it helps, but at what point? And it's scary because like, these doctors don't know what's going to happen to your kids years on. And now they're finding out it's links to autism, ADHD, neurodivergency, and everything else. And it's like, well, what is this? It's baffling to me because, even though I've decided to do better with my life and did all these great things, it still comes up and haunts me. That guilt too. Like, did I do this? Did I do the right thing? What would have happened if I wouldn't have? Or all the X, Y's, and Z's in between. Yeah, I can go on rants about this all day.
That's okay. And then one more question. For someone who maybe is looking for help, whether that would be to, start the recovery journey or continue on, do you have like any suggestions for them, like where to go? Maybe like, I'm sure it's different for every state and everything, but maybe like a place where they could maybe find somebody or someone to help them or to try.
Honestly, it's going to be different in every state and position, but look into your local nonprofits. Not only that, I know in the state of Michigan, Families Against Narcotics, it's going to be a different logo now. I want to say Facing Addiction Now is what it's called. But you can call them, and not only do they have peer recovery coaches, but they have family coaches. They have trainings on their sites. Not only that, you can go to your local health department and find out, like, for example, if you are a Medicaid UPHP, what kind of programs, or even private insurances, what kind of programs do you offer? What can you suggest? X, Y, and Z, also, like, what is it that you're recovering from? First off, figure it out. You could be recovering from multitudes of things, but like ultimately when you're ready, you're ready, the best thing I can do for like resources and things of that nature is like, how bad do you want it? Because it's like those beds aren't open very often, and the only time it's going to work is when you want it to work. So how many trips is it going to take if I tell you the only trip you need to take is the one when you're ready to take it? Not these half-ass attempts, not just people pleasing for someone else or anything else, but like when you're genuinely ready to chuck it all down and just, all right, it is what it is. It's the circumstances and I now have to deal with it. Like, don't feel like you're alone, point blank period. Like, there is so many like different groups on like Facebook, things of that nature, but like you just see it more and more now, and it's becoming even more of a popular thing, like, at social events or festivals. Like, they now have like, peer recovery coaches on deck. Like, if you live in the sober life and you don't want to have a drink, and you know what I'm saying? Or like, different things of that nature. Or, I like getting into, like, those are types of things like, I find peace in, it's not something, there's different paths for everyone, but yeah. Honestly, you could even do a Google search and like look up like resources in your town, county, X, Y, and Z. But yeah, I would definitely recommend reaching out to like different Facebook groups or like, things. That's how I got most of my like, recovery connections, was, following people on Facebook and reaching out and like being able to share my story and like just being in the right place, right time type of stuff. But it wasn't until I put myself in those kinds of environments did I understand, like, oh, like this is a much bigger ongoing thing than I thought really was going on. There's so many more people that are like actively talking about like, I'm recovering, like, let's talk about it.
Right. And I think that's the beauty about social media too. Yes, social media can be horrible, but also, it connects you to people that you may never even meet in your lifetime. But I think it's also a way, the fear that you might have, you mentioned fear of change. people get so stuck in the, this is what we do, this is how I've grown up, this is what I see. So I think that when you're comfortable enough sometimes behind a screen to strangers, it might just be a lot easier to, find somebody to relate with versus trying to speak to your parents or your best friend who has no idea. And
honestly, I still struggle with that. To be honest, like, if there's one thing too about like, not only change, but like I had to learn how to make new friends. Like I had friends that like were still using and like I went to prison and jail with, and like, I wanted different. And I think that was the most hardest thing, because it was like I was trying to fit into places that like if you guys really knew the real me, like would I really be fitting into these places? Or like if you really knew my background, or like, I think that's even like the hardest part when I was, even trying to put myself out there for dating, was like, I may have done all these great things now, but like the moment my past gets brought up, it's like, oh, you shouldn't date her, she's been to prison, you're settling. Or like, oh, she's, she has too much baggage, she has 3 kids. Or like, it was a very discouraging kind of thing. But even to this day, it's hard to like talk to people. And I guess, you're right. It's very hard to like go like talk to people, and especially people who haven't lived through those kinds of things and X, Y, and Z. And I guess you kind of made me have an epiphany moment that I probably should start making more friends instead of staying in her.
I think we all should. Oh my gosh. I had a good time speaking with you. Is there anything maybe we didn't cover, or anything you want to share?
No, I think we covered pretty much everything. And like I said, if you would have told me, 8 years ago that my vulnerability would have been my biggest strength, like it takes guts and it takes like courage in it, but like, what it's like to go in front of like strangers and like tell the deepest, darkest parts of your like life, in hopes that someone else doesn't like try to like go and like do the same things you did, or like in the fear of like, judgment, or like what other people may think. For example, like like it took me a long time to finally take the victim mentality glasses off of like, well, why does everyone hate me? Why are they all judging me? Like, you know what I'm saying? And I guess I didn't understand it in a circumstance where like how other people had to view addiction. Like, for example, having your parents grow up and wondering why, and just, having that stigma against that. And then like, your brother ends up going down the same route. And now you're even more pissed, and like, you just hate the people all around. And like, I had to understand it in so many different lenses. And I guess genuinely it didn't happen until, I put myself back out on the front lines and, was a certified peer recovery coach. And I was, reliving all the worst parts of my life again, just in hopes that somebody else can find recovery. And it took a toll. It took so much toll, and it wasn't something, it's hard, and kudos to all my peer recovery coaches and community health workers and all the people, like, like it takes troopers to do that kind of stuff, and like, counselors, and like reliving and rehashing that type of stuff, but ultimately, sometimes you just have to relive the past in order to heal from it.
Thank you so much again.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Taylor, for sharing that powerful story with us. I really do appreciate your time and your vulnerability. So, up next, we can talk about this whole guilt, shame cycle that we seem to be hearing about. You feel the guilt, so then you hide, and then when you hide, you isolate. So you're isolated, and then the pain grows. So then you use again because you just want the guilt to go away. And I'm not sure if you heard it or not, but in there I said you isolate. And throughout the season we've heard that guilt does what? It thrives in isolation. So this guilt shame cycle, it just keeps going over and over and over and over. And that's why guilt related to substance use is so very dangerous, because that's what feeds the silence. And the silence is what keeps people stuck. Because when you're stuck, you just want the guilt to go away. So you repeat the cycle because that's what you know, and that's what you know works. So today, I just kind of want to rip that silence open. We're absolutely saying that it is okay to admit, I messed up. But you know what? I am still worthy of love. I'm trying. And that counts. I want to do better, even though I failed before. And here's the thing. Guilt doesn't mean that you're broken. It means you care. It means your conscience is working. That you want to repair yourself, to rebuild your relationships, whether that's with yourself or with other people. And also reimagine a life that's whole again. Something that makes you want to live it. A life that makes you happy. So how can we learn to live with this and move through the guilt that comes with substance use? Because it is heavy. We heard it from Taylor, and it's very real. Also, we also heard how tangible and how real it is for her even 8 years later. But it doesn't have to own you forever, and she's proof of that. So I had a few people write in to us about things that help them, kind of like get through this and kind of move through it. And maybe they'll help you too. So one of the biggest things that kept coming through was own what's yours, but not what isn't. So own what's yours, but not what isn't. So yeah, take responsibility. You can absolutely say, I'm sorry, but you don't have to carry the weight of everyone's reactions forever. Those reactions, that guilt that they're projecting onto you is not yours to hold. Another one that came through was making the appropriate amends. So making amends, but also protect your peace while you do it. You may try to make amends with people and they may not forgive you. And that's fine. Forgiveness isn't going to come from everyone. And that's probably a very hard thing to wrap our brains around because we want everyone to forgive us. But it doesn't mean you stop moving forward if someone says, no, I don't forgive you, or I'm sorry, I just can't forgive you. You can forgive yourself. And that part is probably the most important part. Because in order for you to be better, you have to work on you first. Turning your shame into something bigger. Taylor's a perfect example of this. She is now a peer recovery coach. She turned her story, her guilt, into something bigger, and now she's helping others. So maybe that's not for you. Maybe it's just simply showing up for someone who's new in recovery, especially if you're in a group. Maybe it's just being honest with your story to yourself, to your friends, to your family, to anyone who asks you. There's power in that. It doesn't have to be anything big. There is freedom in simply saying that, hey, I've been there too. Like, you're not alone. Which leads us into the next one. Do not do it alone. There is support groups for a reason. Whichever works for you. Whichever substance you're using, like Taylor said, you can simply do a Google search to figure out which support group would be best for you to go through. There's also therapy. There's also people that are just like you. So find those people. Find the people that you can trust. Find the ones that, you can speak with and will support you. Because carrying the guilt by yourself, that's not strength. That's isolation. And you absolutely deserve better than that. And the last one, and the one that I personally really like, is to celebrate every single win. It doesn't matter how small. Every day you stay sober. Every honest conversation. Every time you choose healing over hiding, that counts. That's something to be proud of. Even if no one else sees it, you're doing this. Even if no one else gives you that validation, give yourself that validation. That's enough. The small things are enough. And if no one's told you this before, let me say it now. You are allowed to move forward. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to love yourself again. You are not your addiction. You are not the guilt. You are more. We don't do shame here on Unfiltered Feels. We do truth. We do healing. And we do feelings. All right, that's it for today. Next week, we're exploring a different kind of guilt, family dynamic guilt. And just a reminder, this podcast is all heart, not healthcare. Please talk to a professional for medical advice. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Unfiltered Feels Podcast. Share this with someone who needs it, or leave a review. And don't forget, the things you're feeling, you're not alone. I'll see you next time.